Yeah, I'll probably have to make an announcement for the council meeting.
Soon.
Put in an apology if I can get there.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Declare this meeting open at 6:04. The town of Bassendean acknowledges the past and present traditional owners of the land on which we gather to conduct this meeting and pays its respects to their elders, both past and present. Do we have any apologies tonight? No? Declarations? Announcements? None. Petitions? None. Public question time. We did have some questions from a resident, but I believe that they are going to be forwarded. Okay. So those questions will be sent to that particular person. And I also believe that they will appear on the minutes. Yes? No? No. Okay. So we have 15 minutes of public question time, statements, or addresses by members of the public on matters contained in this agenda. Each member of the public with a question is entitled to ask up to 2 questions before other members of the public will be invited to ask their questions. Statements are restricted to 1 statement for up to 2 minutes unless the council by decision determines that they may speak for more than a further 2 minutes. I should remind people that these proceedings are recorded and live streamed. So I'll invite members of the public to come to the microphone if they would like to ask a question or pose a statement.
Nothing.
Okay. Deputations? None? Okay. So we'll move on to the reports. The first report, 8.1, is use not listed holiday house. And I would ask the officer who'd like to speak to this item.
Through you, Madam Mayor, this report is for Council to consider an application for development approval for a holiday house in Gallagher Street, Eden Hill. The application, as you can see from the officer's report, has been assessed and staff have determined that on balance there is at least some chance that the use could be detrimental or have a detrimental impact on the surrounding low density residential area in which it finds itself. And given the lack of certainty regarding being able to mitigate against the potential risks, staff have recommended that the application be refused for the reasons outlined in the officer report. That said, it is open to Council to form a different view, and in that case it would be suggested that Council only grant time-limited development approval, as is broadly set out on page 10 of the report.
So, councillors, would any councillor like to ask questions on this item? Councillor McLennan?
I was just wondering, there's a comment in the report around there being further complaints since this last came to council over the Christmas period. I'm just seeking to understand whether the Airbnb was still operating during that period and if those complaints were actually investigated by the staff and substantiated.
Through you, Madam Mayor, given the late request from the landowner to have the matter taken off the December agenda, the offer that was made to the owner at the time was that they needed to take their prospective bookings off the platform, but town staff accepted that some bookings had already been made for the December New Year period, and out of, I suppose, respect for those, not so much the owner, but out of respect for those that had booked it, were willing to accept that bookings would be honoured, but in doing so, obviously that prompted further complaints to staff, but given the reasonably transient nature of the use, it was unable to be determined exactly what was transpiring apart from acknowledging that complaints were received.
Okay, thank you. And I was also wondering, if council supported the officer recommendation to refuse the application, I may be wrong, but I understand that there was a previous application for the home-based business that was initially refused and then it was taken to SAT, which might imply that if this was refused, that may be a path that the applicant would take again. Do you have any thoughts around if this was presented to SAT, how they would view this particular application?
Through you, Madam Mayor, not really. I suppose it depends on how the mediation occurred, because typically if it went to SAT, it would start with a directions hearing that would typically proceed to mediation to see if the two parties could come to some agreed position to enable the application to be supported, and it would really be on the applicant at that stage to offer to amend the application in some way, generally, and for the local government to reconsider the application in light of whatever concessions the applicant made. So it's hard to sort of foreshadow what would happen, given it would require some concession to be granted from the applicant. The applicant has, I suppose in fairness, amended the application since it was first lodged, with a view to trying to mitigate the likely impacts that would eventuate from the use. That is acknowledged, but I suppose staff are formed the view that effort notwithstanding, there is still at least some risk that the use would have an impact on the nearby low density area. If it did go to SAT, the reasons that staff have provided are sound planning reasons. That is not to say there is a guarantee that the town would be successful in defending it, but they are genuine planning reasons that could be, depending on how SAT saw it, survive an appeal.
I've got a question after others.
Okay, if I may ask a question. On page 5 of the agenda, it states that the applicant was willing to install noise monitoring devices, but there's no statement about what action would or could be taken in the event of noise breaches. So I was curious how this would work in real time to assist in the mitigation of noise issues.
Through you, Madam Mayor, that's one of the issues that we identified, is that if you go to page
I saw your answer.
8, that there is limited ability for issues to be identified or acted upon before impacting surrounding properties. So a noise monitor is fine for gauging what is happening or happened, but by the time you measured it, it's already had an impact on the surrounding area. So that's one of the concerns, is that whilst the applicant has, I think, genuinely tried to improve the application, some of the measures would still require the amenity to be disturbed for it to be actioned. And I suppose in terms of the broader question from you, Madam Mayor, is that as set out on page 10, if council was to support this either in perpetuity or for a time limited period, condition 1 there would seek to shore up that issue, to say, well, the noise monitoring devices needs to be embedded into the management plan, there needs to be appropriate logging, and there needs to be appropriate information provided to the town. That's all reasonable, but again, going back to my previous comment, it doesn't actually resolve the issue, in that the amenity has to be disturbed for something to happen. So for that reason, staff have taken a reasonably cautious view and recommended the application be refused.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Lifter.
So in terms of short-term accommodation in that locality, I mean, you've mentioned that there's low density surrounding. And is it the case that if there were somebody that were an exemplary owner and took all reasonable measures, that they would find success in this area, or is this simply an area within our town that we're saying isn't suitable for this sort of usage?
Through you, Madam Mayor, probably the latter, because it is very difficult for the planning system to judge what you were saying in terms of whether or not they are exemplary custodian of the business. You don't really know until it's operating, by which time it's probably too late, unless of course council does want to effectively give in effect a trial, whether it's 3, 6, 12 months, whatever. Council could give a bit of a period for the owner to operate and then evaluate the success or otherwise after that period has lapsed. Again, going back to the somewhat speculative nature of it all, is there is nothing to say they couldn't be exemplary business owners for 12 months and then not thereafter. And I suppose that brings me back to the land use assessment, whereby staff have formed the view that given the suburban low density nature of it all, it may well not be the most appropriate location. Now, if, say, this was a use hypothetically proposed in and around the Bassendean town centre, it is subject to a completely different planning assessment because of the location and context. But in terms of the subject application, it's in an area that's broadly R17.5, R20, large suburban blocks. You can drive around there, there's very little activity day to day. It's quite suburban. This use, in the view of staff, is not quite the right fit.
In terms of the local planning scheme, how they're standardising those, the planning scheme that we're going to have going forward, what sort of usage will that apply to short-term accommodation? And will we be assigning different areas, different usages for those purposes?
Through you, Madam Mayor, it may well be done through a local planning policy as opposed to the scheme, because the scheme will set out the land use permissibility relative to the zone. Now, I wouldn't say that the use is inappropriate on every residential zone site, because the context between a R17.5 site and an R80 site is completely different. So I don't think you'd want to have a hard prohibition on the use, but council may want to have a local planning policy to guide its decision making to focus the use on those areas of greater density and therefore greater activity, and in most cases a lower expectation of residential amenity.
Just the final question, the R17.5, I mean that's fairly low density compared to the town as a whole. I think the town's usually R20 and above.
Through you, Madam Mayor, a lot of the town doesn't really have a single base code. It's got a lot of R17.5 and a lot of R20. The contemporary approach would be to make R20 the base code. If you look at most other local governments that had R17.5, because it was the base code of the day, every subsequent scheme has increased the base code to R20. So the town will be seeking to do that as well. So.
Thank you.
Councillor Morgan. Haynes.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. That's no dramas. Yeah, through you to Mr. Gibson. Obviously, there's been some complaints that have been risen from this particular property. Take away this particular property, has there been any other noise complaints or disturbance complaints in the area, just in general? Are we talking about a group of residents that are quite sensitive to, I suppose, noise and disruption in the area, or has it solely been in and around this particular land lot that these complaints have been in the past, if you have any information on that?
Through Madam Mayor, happy to confirm with the rangers and the health officers during the week, but my understanding is that the complaints are solely about this property, not just the use of it as a holiday house, but there was an event that occurred pre-Christmas that prompted some complaints as well. So I don't think it's a case of there's lots of complaints about lots of properties. I think it's reasonably well targeted to this site.
Sure. And I've just got one more to wrap up my question time, and it's regarding your officer recommendation about a particular trial period. Let's just say, for example, if council did approve a 6-month period of time and there was no bookings in that 6 months, obviously that doesn't really put this into action to find out what's going down. Would it be a matter of, I suppose, council deciding either time frame or bookings? Because I would like to think that potentially you've got some bookings that might be quite timid and quite sort of quiet in regards to whatever they would like to use the residents for. I suppose that's a decision for council to make moving forward, if that was the case.
Through Madam Mayor, yes, that's correct. So the staff recommendation is to refuse the application, but the alternative offered up on page 10 is a time limited approval. If council pursued that time limited approval, we could choose the time and it would have a subsequent decision to make at the conclusion of that time as to what it does. if the applicant in fact lodged an application, it may well be, that the applicant did 6 months, and for whatever reason that came and went and didn't seek to lodge an application for extension, and the use would have no further approval. So it would also, if the applicant did however lodge a subsequent application, it would then be open to council to pursue the same options that are before it now, and it could be 6 months at a time in perpetuity, or at some point council could be sufficiently satisfied that it approves it once and for all, or it could be dissatisfied and refuses it. So if council pursues the alternative on page 10, it doesn't fetter its future decision making.
Yes, yes. And so whilst you've just mentioned a few things there, I do have one final question about this item agenda here. Has the officers or the town provided like a template for the application process for this particular application? So you need A, B, C, D and E to this extent. Due to the fact that you've got some information there regarding the environmental protection and noise regulations, was that even a discussion that was with the landowner at the very beginning of this application to say that you've got to tick X number of boxes before we can actually really consider your application in the first place?
Through you, Madam Mayor, I believe the officers dealing with the application had a number of discussions and sought further information at the time. If you recall the agenda item that was briefly on the agenda for December, that concluded that the applicant had really failed to provide enough information despite the town making the requests. Since that time, the applicant has furnished us with a lot more information, which allows a more fulsome assessment. But I'm not sure if we went through every sort of act and regulations with them. The issue with the noise regulations was probably something that came late in the piece, given that it was a recent addition to the discussions care of the applicant, effectively offering up a noise monitoring device. But if council was to approve the application and impose those conditions, we'd obviously talk to the applicant about what that all means and the format they need to provide the information.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. It says that the local government can determine that the use is not consistent with the objectives of the zone. Would you agree that the application as it's put forward to us doesn't meet any of the objectives and actually works against points A, B and E? A, B and E to limit non-residential activities.
Through you, Madam Mayor, broadly accept the proposition raised by the councillor. I suppose if you look at the top of page 7, we acknowledge that it wasn't necessarily consistent with the objectives, because if it was consistent with the objectives under the scheme, it would have been permitted. But we also didn't form the view that it was explicitly inconsistent, so we adopted what we considered to be a balanced view and suggested it may be consistent, and were prepared to assess it on its merits. So certainly not suggesting it is consistent with the objectives, because that would have led it down a different assessment path.
If I may just have one more question. I note the actual lots, the adjoining lots are very long and skinny, with the built form on both lots that look like they're almost adjoining. I haven't had a chance to actually drive up there and have a look from the outside, but I would assume that that built form on both those properties would make it very, very difficult to mitigate noise, given the properties both appear to be very, very closely aligned on the property.
Through you, Madam Mayor, that wasn't of a particular concern to staff, because if managed appropriately, the use could exist such that it didn't have an impact beyond that of a single house. And I suppose if we could be guaranteed that the impacts wouldn't exceed that of a single house, I would suggest we would find the application acceptable. So it's less so about the built form and the width of the blocks, whilst we do acknowledge that closer format housing does exacerbate impacts. it is more about that the management is effectively a day-to-day proposition and controlled exclusively by parties outside the town's control. And whilst we can regulate aspects of a development, in this particular instance, we couldn't regulate it such that we could guarantee that there would be no impacts. The best we could do would be putting things in place to reduce the likelihood and to respond to breaches. But we think, on balance, given the low density area, the impact or the threat or risk of impact is too great in this instance.
So am I to assume that if there is an ongoing series of complaints into the future, if this was approved, that it would possibly impact on some of our service areas like rangers and whatever who are called out to actually deal with this? Would that be a potential side effect of this activity?
Through you, Madam Mayor, yes, certainly. I suppose any complaints to the town, it goes to some business unit, whether it's the planning section, the environmental health section, the rangers section, or some other section. It needs to be dealt with. So if council was to approve an application that gave rise to further complaints, that would have a resource implication.
So, councillors, unless we've got any more questions, we'll move on to the next item. So the next item is 8.2, review of council policy 4.2, art acquisition and management. So would like to speak to this? Yes.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. The purpose of this report is for council to consider its policy settings in relation to its arts collection, now and in the future. And just for the avoidance of any doubt, this policy relates to indoor wall art or museum art, for want of a better term, as opposed to outdoor public art, which will be dealt with as part of the next item. The fact that the two art items on the same agenda is mere coincidence, and they're dealing with separate subjects. Council currently has a policy that was last reviewed in 2014, and its review is part of the ongoing review of Council's suite of policies, but it's also a task identified in the adopted corporate business plan as a required action. In terms of the policy itself, it has been reviewed and determined that there may be some value in retaining it in some form as opposed to completely revoking it, so long as it provided improved guidance on both the acquisition and decommissioning processes. And as set out in the officer report, it is recommended that council adopt the draft amended policy.
Thank you. So, councillors, would anyone like to ask a question on this one? Councillor Blifka, then Councillor Clennon, then Councillor Ames.
Just in 1.3 of the policy, decommissioning, I see that decommissioning is defined to be sale, donation or disposal. Is archiving something which could be a possibility?
Through you, Madam Mayor, I would suggest archiving probably falls under the management, because whilst we could archive it, if we are still the custodians and the owners, we wouldn't have decommissioned it. So I would suggest archiving is practically possible, but it wouldn't be under the broad banner of decommissioning.
The distinction between something which is only having active status, is that active in the sense that it's available for the public to inspect, or just active in that we have a desire to retain it?
Through you, Madam Mayor, the latter. So it can be active whilst not on public display. If it was deactivated, the contrary term would be under the decommissioning.
The final thing was just in terms of the priority process for returning the artworks. How would we deal with a situation where somebody has donated an artwork which they consider to be of value? We take a different view and then say, well, thanks but no thanks, take your artwork back. I mean, how do we navigate that? It seems that if something is of value to them, unless the item itself is intrinsically offensive, is there some other process that we could embark upon rather than just essentially throwing their gift back at them?
Through you, Madam Mayor, I don't think the intent is to sort of return it to them. I think if you look at the 1.3C, there's a process in a sequential order, and it may well be that it is redeployed to a more appropriate collective body, in which case the art still lives on, it just doesn't belong to the town.
If we then go to the second dot point, then we're handing it back to them potentially.
And that is, I suppose, a decision for council. This is, I suppose, based on a environmental scan of what's occurring in other places. But if council had a firm view about a different process, this would be the place to embed that view.
Thank you.
I think partially what I was asking has already been addressed. So mine was in relation to the decommissioning process as well, and the first priority being donated. So I was just curious to understand the rationale for that being the first priority, and is it related to what you just said and the concerns that Councillor Lithgow raised about the sensitivity of artwork and the value that different people might place on it?
Through you, Madam Mayor, I believe so. This is something we've effectively imported from other like policies, but I'd suggest that the methodology, the thinking was to that effect is that if the art was appropriate to obtain in the first place, maybe it is appropriate that it is retained in some form, albeit not by the town. If the town has decided it's reached the end of its useful life at or with the town, but the art still has some value, that value can be transferred to another more appropriate institution.
Thank you. And so just following on from that, if the art has some value, particularly if we've purchased it, if it is then just donated, then that investment that the town has made is essentially being lost. So how would the staff balance up those two competing interests in terms of trying to make sure that the town's investment continues to be something that's valued as opposed to making sure the artists and their work is, I don't know the right word, but I think you understand.
Yeah, absolutely. Through you, Madam Mayor, I suppose this is broadly established practice, but I don't think it binds council in any way. I'd suggest if council or the town has purchased and owns an artwork and it has proprietary rights over that artwork, it can do with it what it pleases within reason. If council's preference was to focus on a financial return to cover the original cost of acquisition, that is something that can be written into the policy. But I suppose in terms of what's being put before council for the purpose of this discussion is simply based off other examples of arts management policies.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and to Mr Gibson as well. My question is regarding around, I suppose, donation of artworks and obviously the value of them, and if they were to be moved on by the town. Firstly, artworks, would that be considered solely art? Are we looking at also things like heritage images, memorabilia from different sporting associations within the town, and all that sort of jazz? So where, I suppose, do they fall into the art category, if anything at all? Let's just say there was a, the Bassendean Footy Club or the Ashford Soccer Club was to offer some sort of memorabilia, obviously being within the town. Does that sort of fall into this scope as well?
Through you, Madam Mayor, I suppose it could potentially. We haven't really turned our mind to that because we don't have any memorabilia. We have various pieces of art, I think 50 in all. As far as I'm aware, we don't have any other items that have been gifted to us. But the scope of the policy could be expanded to cover those sorts of things. But I suppose it hasn't been done by staff because we just simply don't have that material.
Yep, that's good. And let's just say something was donated and it was of quite, it wasn't quite a valuable piece. Would the town be looking to move on that via potentially moving it free of charge? But if there was some value, would the town like to recoup some financials based on the value of whatever piece of art or memorabilia might be offloaded?
Through you, Madam Mayor, I suppose that is the decision for council next Tuesday, is how it assembles this policy to guide the staff's operational response. So if council has a particular view about an process and the, I suppose, the hierarchy of responses and the priority of responses, this is the policy in which to set those down, because once council adopts it, it will be operationalised by staff. So if there's any amendments to the policy during the week to effectively that last clause, I imagine, staff can certainly review any changes council wants to make.
And last question on this, just in a nutshell, Mr. Gibson, where is the majority of the art that is on show within the town?
Through Madam Mayor, for those that have been here a little while, you'll recall that a lot of it was in, or some of it was in this room, until probably 18 months ago, I suppose. It is located in various spots around the district. There's some in the administration offices, and I believe there's also a good number. I think there's some in the foyer in terms of the some of the
cutlery, bird, and so on and so forth. Yes,
those sorts of things. Yes.
Yep.
There's also a number of pieces in storage, so not archived per se in terms of Councillor Pleaker's comment before, but just simply being stored.
Sure.
I think some of the libraries. Councillor McLeod.
Yes.
And then Councillor Carter.
Through to Mr. Gibson. Just looking at the any removal to be undertaken based on the following priority phases. So we assume 1.3 decommissioning. There are certain attitudes, and particularly in Aboriginal art, that the art never actually belongs totally to somebody else. It's worth taking that into account, and that that we might seek some advice on how we might honour that sort of requirement where it exists, so whether we can choose to reflect upon and ask that that be part of any decommissioning. The other thing I was thinking was that perhaps a Bassendean based public option, or not sort of widely public necessarily, but we could consider wider than the town of Bassendean residents, etc., might be a good community event, and seeing local artists on once a year. Just a few ideas there that might be able to be considered.
Mr. Gibson, would you be able to?
Take that as a comment, Madam Mayor.
Councillor Carter.
Oh, thank you, Madam Mayor. I just would like to clarify something about art and memorabilia and archives, because they are very separate things. Art is a creative endeavour. Memorabilia is a collection of objects that belong to some sort of historical overview or personal overview. And archives, of course, are something else entirely. The library, as far as I'm aware, does contain collections of memorabilia which are connected to collections in that local history collection. So I think we'd need to make a distinction about art as a creative endeavour, and memorabilia and archives. Thank you.
Your question, I'm assuming your question is, could policy distinguish between distinctly distinguish between memorabilia and artworks? Is that correct?
Yes, it is, and archives as well. Thank you.
Okay.
Through Madam Mayor, yes, we can add something to. Yeah, we can add some words to the policy to make that distinction.
Thank you very much.
If you don't mind, I've got a question as well. There's a statement in the attachment that the collection is to be housed in venues owned and managed by the town. Have the administration explored the potential to lease out some of these artworks to local businesses or clubs? Has there been any sort of exploration of that sort of idea?
Through Madam Mayor, not particularly, no. That provision in the draft amended policy is taken from the existing policy.
Yep.
So on page 55 of the attachments. Again, if council wants to do certain things with its art collection, this policy would be the appropriate vehicle to set those desires out. I will make the comment that I suppose this policy was distributed in the council, in the CO bulletin, and no comments were received. So that notwithstanding, we can make some further changes to the draft policy, but it is the appropriate mechanism for council to set out its sort of objectives in relation to art.
If I can follow on, clearly we have art in storage and potentially not in the best storage conditions, because often art needs certain conditions to actually be stored correctly. And I would concede that there are potentially some items that should leave that are no longer of value, and others that should be retained. So sorting this out, but can I ask long-term view, if we're retaining, I don't know, a portion of these artworks, long-term view, would it not be appropriate that we're actually aiming to exhibit these pieces of art in public buildings once we actually renew some of our buildings? Because this has been one of the issues, that we don't have the facilities like other local governments to exhibit those works of art. So if we're looking at that as a long-term aim, could I put a guess on that it might be years before we get to that point?
Through you, Madam Mayor, I suppose the existing policy, the draft amendment policy, has a provision about housing it in town-owned or town-managed facilities, giving priority to public areas over private offices. I suppose if the question is, when will we have a facility that is better able to house these artworks, that is a question far broader than the scope of this policy, and probably goes back to the Town Centre Master Plan and the towns and council's aspirations for town centre vibrancy and rationalisation of dated built form assets. This may be one that Peter might want to touch on, but there are various things in the corporate business plan which speak to that point. But obviously there are a few bridges to cross on that before we have a brand new building for whatever purpose in whatever location. But I think it would be reasonable to take the view that any planning we do for a new building, wherever that may be, should at least have regard to the fact that we want to house some of our existing artworks. Whether that's in the existing library, or whether it's in a future Jubilee pavilion, or whether it's in a future multi-purpose community hub. That, I think, those opportunities can be pursued as the buildings themselves are constructed.
Thank you, Mr. Gibson. I think in a very roundabout way, what I was alluding to is that we have this art, clearly some should be retained. How do we actually manage to have this stuff on display until we're ready to put some on? So that's why I came up with the question about the potential of perhaps long-term leasing, or even long-term. If we could explore that idea a little bit, I'd be very interested in the administration's point of view on that, whether there are alternatives where we can potentially outsource this material for a period of time, so that when we're ready we can reclaim it.
Through you, Madam Mayor, certainly can look at that. Obviously the policy is trying to focus on town-managed facilities, but that is not to say that once those opportunities have been exhausted, that staff can't look further afield at what other opportunities may exist. I suppose we just need to be mindful of, if we were providing the art to a third party to house in their establishment, whether we're comfortable that it would be appropriately looked after, cared for and returned to the town. But we can certainly look into that.
Thank you very much. Councillor Plivka.
Just note that service is provided by Art Bank. They do that sort of thing, so it is something which can be done. In terms of the artwork themselves, would we be able to inspect them prior to the council meeting? Because I mean, it's all a bit abstract to me without seeing, you know, what we're actually dealing with.
Through you, Madam Mayor, we could, there'd be various pieces you could probably see, but I'm not sure we'd be able to access all 50 of them before next Tuesday.
Well, I mean, I suppose a simple example would be that, you know, dealing with the composition of them, in that, I mean, not being an art expert, I mean, majority of us would probably say, you know, what was Indigenous art and what wasn't, and that might give us a idea as to, you know, what the balance is between that and the collection. So we'd have a better overall feel, and we'd know are they watercolours of the river, made from back in the 19th century, which show a different time. Just to understand what we're actually dealing with.
Through you, Madam Mayor, I suppose, as I understand it, it's quite varied, but we might be able to provide some information on the nature of the collection.
Thank you.
Councillor Ames.
Just following on from Councillor Pwifka's sort of comment there, maybe that there might be like an opportunity for us to get some sort of like booklet of them. Catalogue. That's what. Thanks, Councillor McLennan. However it is easy to sort of snap them up and put together on a bulletin or something like that. Thoughts?
Through you, Madam Mayor, I believe before my time here, some requests were made to council to have that as a project, to actually have them professionally photographed and actually go on the website, but council at the time didn't support the request. But that said, we could rescope that and provide some information to council.
Thank you, Ms. Gibson.
Okay, if we're finished with questions on that one, we'll move on to item 8.3. Local planning policy number 15, Centre for Art policy. So again, Mr. Gibson.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. This is the other art policy that I referred to in my last introduction. And this is, the purpose of this report is for council to consider its policy settings in relation to the outdoor public art, being art that is generally procured using funds provided by developers in response to a condition of development approval. This matter was previously considered by council in December last year, where council resolved to advertise the policy for public comment. That advertising took place, however no submissions were received, and as such it is recommended that council adopts the policy as contained as an attachment to the report. Further, and arguably more the issue that warrants council's attention tonight, next Tuesday, is the recommendation from staff that council agree to effectively hold the implementation of the policy in abeyance for a period as a means of trying to encourage and promote development within the town centre. If that said, if council's content with the policy but doesn't want to hold it in abeyance, it can do both. It can adopt the policy and delete the second half of the recommendation, but the recommendation is as written, in that it would assist the town in promoting the opportunities for development within the town centre, broadly in line with the adopted town centre master plan and the SCP.
Councillor McLennan.
Thank you for that. Just to clarify, so point 2 around suspending application until 2026, is it for applications that are received by that date or that are approved by that date?
Through you, Madam Mayor, it would be when the trigger arises. So what would need to happen is typically the contribution would need to be made to the town prior to the issuing of a building permit or prior to commencement of construction, as the case may be. What we'd be saying is, so long as the building permit was obtained before that date, we would recommend the council not seek the contribution.
Is that something that would be obvious to the applicant, or would it require clarification?
It would require, through you, Madam Mayor, require clarification. I suppose this is more seeking council's agreement to the philosophy and the principle. If council indeed agreed to it, we would envisage doing up some promotion, because there's no point in agreeing to it and not promoting it
Yep.
because it defeats the purpose. So we would want to promote it fairly heavily as a sign that council is fully engaged with the town centre master plan and is pulling the levers that it can to try and encourage development. So we would very much focus on the comms on that one.
Great. And a somewhat unrelated question. You'd remember that there's been quite a lot of discussion whenever the public arts come up in the past around that we're trying to attract high quality artists that have got a career in that area, that have got an established portfolio, and the conversation's been around those members of the community or beyond who are not yet established, and the town's ability to support them. Has there been any consideration since those discussions about how that might happen, not necessarily through this policy, but where that could fit into the town?
Through Madam Mayor, I suppose it would be a case of making sure that the process was suitably open. I think it needs to be remembered that the funds being used under this policy are not municipal funds allocated by council. They are funds provided by a developer as part of the condition of development approval. So I don't necessarily think it's appropriate to use those funds to further council's other objectives in terms of encouraging local artists.
Yeah, I wasn't clear because I meant outside of this policy, like accepting that this is for largely developer contributions, and you want it to be a certain standard. We obviously don't want something that's substandard being provided, but it's not necessarily something to answer now. But I know there's been a lot of conversation about the desire for us. This isn't the place to be able to support local artists and provide them with an opportunity to display art and so on, whether there might be other things we can consider in future that might fulfil that objective.
Yeah, through Madam Mayor, I suppose certainly the one that comes to mind straight away is the sponsorship of grants / community funding program. That is, that very much speaks to this issue. If there was a young or budding artist or artists or community group that wanted to focus on art, the community funding policy is there. We also have a fairly good relationship with the local schools and Cyril Jackson, and there's been things that have fallen out of that relationship or those relationships. Otherwise, it is very much open to council to allocate funds, municipal funds, as part of any budget for the purpose of the public art, and if it did that, it would have a great deal more freedom to procure art from certain artists. Council, as I understand it, has not done that for some time, if at all, but it need not necessarily, because we have other avenues to support local artists, the main one I suggest being the community funding policy.
Great, thank you.
James?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Mayor, and to Mr. Gibson. The reason for the 4-year hold period, is there a particular reason why 4-year was picked rather than shorter or longer? If you were to adopt this and place the policy on hold for that period of time?
Through you, Madam Mayor, there is a reason. I was trying to find the reference to it. So the top of page 18 talks about the state of emergency provisions as it relates to the planning system, whereby the validity period of development approvals was extended, and this simply sought to mirror that. It is not it's not mandatory at all. It's open to council to not hold it in abeyance, or alternatively hold it in abeyance for a different period. And similarly with the Gallagher Road report, it would be open for council to hold it in abeyance for a year, and then another year, and then 2 years, then stop, or any other combination. One decision to hold it in abeyance doesn't fetter any subsequent decision. So we're recommending a 4-year time period because it marries up with the emergency provisions, and it would be long enough that it's worth promoting. If council was to put the brakes on for a month, it would have little to no impact, and you wouldn't get much benefit out of the promotion. So we think 4 years is long enough to hopefully encourage developers to take a closer look at the town of Bassendean.
Thank you, Mr. Gibson.
So Mr. Gibson, if I can jump in there. With the current situation, it's my understanding that the administration have in the past had the ability to waive
JDAP waived that on the recommendation of staff and council. So JDAP made the decision, the staff made a recommendation to council, and council made a recommendation to JDAP, and JDAP indeed waived it.
So, long story short, we had the ability to recommend waiving that 1% for art fee. And if my memory is correct, it played out in a way that enabled other things to be done in that development instead of having the art. So my question is, would it not be appropriate to retain, instead of waiving this for 4 years, to retain this and use it as a, on a case-by-case basis to potentially negotiate good outcomes?
Through you, Madam Mayor, yes, that is certainly an option for council. I would suggest if council wanted to pursue that, it would be useful to get a feeling from council if that is the direction it wants to take, because we'd probably do well to draft a provision that speaks to that. Because at the moment the policy is effectively saying, as a general rule, the provision applies. Obviously, if there's a council resolution that holds it in abeyance for 4 years, that applies. But if council wants to build into the policy, and it may or may not, if it wants to build into the policy effectively an exemption provision and set out the manner in which it would seek to apply those exemptions, we can do that. We just need an understanding from council how it would want to apply that exemption going forward.
Councillor Clifford.
If we go to page 17 of the agenda, the first dot point there says developments which exceed 2 million. Is that ought to be 2 million, or should that be 1 million? Because just in the attachment it speaks of 1 million. So if you go to the 2.2.1 for projects eligible, it mentions works greater than $1 million in value.
Through you, Madam Mayor, sorry, Councillor, which clause are you referring to in the draft?
2.2.1 of the attachment.
Yeah, you're the
Oh,
draft
that's the old
already.
policy.
Yeah, sorry, yes.
So
So if you go to clause 4 of the draft amended policy application refers to 2 million.
So we've changed that from 1 to 2 million.
Through Madam Mayor, yes, that's correct, and that's to align with the state's guidance on the matter.
As a result of that, the threshold for the JDAP is 2 million as well.
Through Madam Mayor, for optional for opt-in applications.
So potentially we could have people opting in and obtaining the same result, whereby the JDAP decides to waive the contribution.
Through Madam Mayor, potentially, but I suppose in terms of the example the Mayor cited, that it wasn't just the JDAP unilaterally waiving it. It was a negotiated proposal between the town and the applicant on the basis, broadly, that they were restoring a heritage.
No, I'm not suggesting that's a bad outcome, but just using that as an example. That there
Yes,
may
I
be
suppose
ones where the building is less beneficial to the town than the renovated hotel will be.
Yeah, I suppose that was the justification, and that stacks up from a planning point of view. But if the inference was the JDAP just simply waived it, it wasn't that simplistic. It was as part of the broader package.
So the 1% applies across the entire town. Is that correct?
Through you, Madam Mayor, not to industrial development.
Just say for industrial. And then the town centre itself, there's additional contributions there, or not? Those have since been.
Through you, Madam Mayor, not at this stage. Obviously, there are some in the community that are advocating for a development contribution plan or plans. That is an option that will be explored as part of the precinct structure plan, but at the moment, the this would be the contribution. Obviously, there is also coming before council the short term would be the draft public open space strategy, and that, depending on council's decision making around that, may establish a contribution requirement to cash in lieu of public open space.
And those could all be cumulative, or there would be a cap? So say, could you have the public open space on top of the development contribution on top of the percentage for art?
Through Madam Mayor, if they would all operate in isolation, typically, because they're dealing with fundamentally different things and seeking to fund fundamentally different things. Obviously, in council's decision making, it can have regard to the cumulative effect of all these contributions, but if it sought to impose them all, they would all apply individually.
Yeah, so somebody looking in without knowing how the council is going to rule on a particular application might potentially be spooked and say, well, there's this, there's that, and there's that, and they might say, well, worst case scenario is add them all together, and that may well be, I suppose, adverse to having more development sooner rather than later. Would we then seek to temper those in the same way as is being recommended to this policy, which is to have that moratorium so that people can get their affairs in order if they are genuinely interested in doing business in Bassendean?
Through Madam Mayor, quite possibly. I suppose we haven't prepared the material for council's sort of review, but it would certainly be a possibility that, particularly for, you couldn't do it for a development contribution plan because they're sort of quite contained arrangements, and the infrastructure needs to be paid for, so you can't just provide waivers. So it couldn't apply to a DCP, but it could certainly apply to the public open space strategy,
Thank
which
you.
is a decision for another time for council.
Yeah, thank you.
Councillor, is there any more questions on this item? So we'll move on to item 8.4, review of various council policies. Mr Gibson.
Through you, Madam Mayor. This report is for council to consider the revoking a series of council policies. I won't go through each one in detail, but staff have reviewed them and deemed them to provide little decision-making guidance and therefore being of little value. Revocation of these policies, as recommended, will have little to no impact on the current operation or service delivery of the town to the community.
Councillors, questions? Councillor Wilding.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. My question is to Mr Gibson. Just very broadly, I understand that you weren't here when the majority of these policies were implemented, but how do we end up with so many redundant policies to revoke in the first place?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. That's a very good question, Councillor. These policies, as the councillors that have been here longer than I have would know, seemingly all were reviewed in 2014, where it seems a blanket review was undertaken, obviously long before any of the current staff were here, but it would seem that the review was potentially a bit superficial and didn't really dive into the detail of the policies to see if they were adding a lot of value to the decision-making process. And in many cases, it seems like the policies were created to respond to a specific event at a specific time. And there may well have been a feeling at the time that it would be difficult or impossible to make a decision without a policy, but I'm just simply speculating based on what I've seen over the last 2 or so years. But I suppose with new staff comes fresh eyes, and we have gone through seeing, when I first got here, the large number of policies that we had and the limited oversight of those policies, because there was a lot of policies that a lot of long-serving staff did not know about, which probably speaks to the value of those policies, and it's good practice in any event. I'm sure Ms Kenya will second this, that it's a good policy, pardon the pun, from a governance point of view, to make sure your policies are up to date and actually assisting with your decision making and not just sitting there clogging up the website. So staff from community planning, and I think it's going to be happening more broadly across the organisation from now on, have gone through, and you will have noticed, if you've think back to the last 20 or so agendas. We've been slowly ticking these over, and from a community planning point of view, we are, once council hopefully adopts as recommended next Tuesday, we're very close to the end. But again, it's not just a case of leaving all the existing policies on the shelf, it is about making sure they are contemporary and fit for purpose and reflecting council's direction and actually providing some guidance to staff. So that's a long-winded speculation on my part, but I suppose I can assure council that staff are working to try and consolidate the policy suite.
Thank you very much.
Any more questions, councillors? Councillor Clifford.
So the mental health policy, I mean, that just seems to restate that state policy, this act, belong, commit. I mean, is that really even a policy? I mean, what does it do?
Madam Mayor, in my humble opinion, I'd say no, it's not a policy, but I suppose that sort of underpins the staff recommendation. It is not particular to that policy. I'm sure some of the councillors that have been here a while have probably heard me talk reasonably frequently about the need for policies to provide some decision-making guidance. It seems a lot of our policies probably were less so decision-making guidance in a classical policy sense, but more a statement of intent or a statement of opinion or a position statement of sorts. Didn't actually help any decisions to be made, but it sort of put the council's flag in the ground and said, on this particular issue, we believe in this. So some of those things have been transitioned to other documents that are more appropriate. So that's a lot of the information hasn't been completely jettisoned. Some of it has been moved on to information sheets. Some of it has been moved on to position statements. Some of it has been moved on to FAQs. But we're trying to keep the policies to those issues that we need decision-making guidance on.
The sun protection policy, has that found its way into some sort of occupational health and safety guideline? Because I'm obviously thinking about external workers, people, rangers out in the sun all day. Has that found its way somewhere so that we ensure that they are at least given the ability to
Yes, we have a whole framework around occupational health and safety for our workers in terms of whether it's working in the sun, in terms of wearing longs and longs, long sleeves, long trousers. We also provide a number of programs like pulse, skin checks, etc. So yes, it is embedded into our occupational health and safety.
So you've already gone over and above, so the policy can be disregarded because it's covered elsewhere. Thank you.
Okay, so councillors, if we're done with that one, we'll move on to 8.5, which is parking designation Bassendean Oval. Mr. Gibson again.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. This report of the council to consider designating a car parking bay at Bassendean Oval for use by a specific class of people and stems from council's decision in November 2021. Broadly, it is something that council is able to do under the Park and Local Law. However, the staff assessment concluded there is nothing to suggest that the response is warranted at this time, particularly in this location, and therefore it is recommended that no change is made. That said, it is very open to council to proceed with the designation. It is achievable. It comes with a fairly negligible cost, although it does represent potentially some implementation challenges. So the recommendation is to not proceed at this time, but probably more broadly review parking as part of the future precinct structure plan that obviously council needs to embark upon in the coming years. But if council wishes to make a change now, it is able to do so.
Councillors, questions? Councillor Ames.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and to Mr. Gibson. What are the stipulations for infringements under the ACROD, I suppose, parking bays? You might not know this question, because from my understanding is that individuals that are infringing on parking in an Acrod bay where the bay is not actually sign pointed can't really incur an infringement. So if it's painted on the ground as an Acrod bay, but there's no actual sign to say that if you park in this bay, there'll be a fine attached to your invalid parking, that parking bay is just a parking bay.
Through Madam Mayor, I'll have to take that one on notice, but I'd suggest it being painted in the standard blue, as is stipulated in the Australian standard, would suffice. But happy to confirm that. Although I suppose happy to communicate that to the board, and given that it doesn't particularly bear any impact on this report.
Yeah, that would be super if you can, Mr. Gibson, because it may impact this report, because depending on where, if council approves this car bay to go, I believe that the Acrod bay is in the middle of the Swan District's car parking precinct. So having not only painted on the ground, but also having a sign there as well would obviously be not too, I suppose, practical. If the legislation within Acrod parking states that not only does it have to be sign painted on the ground, but also a sign erected to say that, or for infringements to actually be pinged by the offending driver or parker. So if you could provide some further information about that regarding what needs to be in place for an infringement to be warranted, that would be great.
Through you, Madam Mayor, is that for the Acrod bay or for the bay for a specific class of?
It would be for both, I would say.
For the matter, the subject of the report being the bay for a specific class of people,
yes,
which is not Acrod,
right?
Yes, a sign must be provided,
right?
So for it to be legitimised,
yep,
and for infringements to be issued pursuant to it, and for it to be an offence,
yep,
a sign must be installed, and that we estimate will cost about $300.
And where would that sign go within the map that's been provided here? Oh, I suppose obviously you've only got a little purple area there, but that would be in between the bays where two abutting car bays would be.
Correct. That's right.
Be positioned.
So it would be a case of there'd be a sign which is easy enough to put on the line that I suppose joins two bays lengthways. All that would mean is someone couldn't drive through that bay, but that is okay because they can reverse out.
Right.
But yeah, certainly to legitimise the designation, a sign needs to be provided.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Gibson. That's all.
Okay, so any more questions on that one? Okay, we'll move on to item 8.6, Sandy Beach Reserve Foreshore Restoration Plan.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So an item's been put up for Council to consider allocating funding in next financial year's budget for development of the Sandy Beach Foreshore Restoration Plan. So the town's been successful in a riverbank grant EOI, which will fund approximately half of the cost, and the remaining funds are required to be funded by Council. We've undertaken a request for quotation process, and we've identified a preferred consultant, and the works will be undertaken over 2 financial years. So the reason that council approval is required is because we can't engage the consultant without having a budget allocated for next financial year. So it will cover the entire length of Sandy Beach foreshore, which is about 260 linear metres. And the main reason that the works are required is that there's an existing jetty, which is a DBCA jetty, and on either side there's timber walling, which is failing. So if that eventually fails, it could affect public safety and the ability to access the jetty. But we're looking at the entire foreshore area, not just where the timber wall is. And it will be more important with the nature playground being completed, with more people using that area. And also it will complement the Ashfield Flats master planning, which will be undertaken over a similar time period.
Thank you. If I can just ask a quick question on that. Clearly the red sections in the map are state-owned parts of the foreshore, and the rest is ours. So just very roughly, it looks like about a third of that foreshore does not come under the management of the town. But we're looking at getting the consultant to actually do the planning for all of that. Does this mean that ultimately the department, the state government department, will contribute financially to the restoration councillor Statham.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So approximately 100 linear metres is Department of Planning and 250 is the towns. The additional cost to include the Department of Planning area for the foreshore concept is quite low, and we'll be asking for a contribution from DPLH, and they're quite open to that. In terms of the final restoration works, it's still undecided whether DPLH will contribute or it could be potentially able to be funded through riverbank funding. That's another option.
Councillors, Councillor Pletka.
Following on from the Mayor's line of questioning, so the jetty is owned by the department, and the wooden wall which is retaining the soil is on our land. So we're essentially working on retaining land for the benefit of the department's jetty. Would the department not also be contributing towards that, given that it is ancillary to their jetty?
Through you, Madam Mayor. So it's an unusual situation. The land where the jetty is located is the town's land, and the jetty belongs to Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions, and they are funding the riverbank grant. So they're providing $30,000 towards the project.
And in terms of the, so this is just the cost to commission the study, and so the experts might come back and say that we potentially, not preempting anything, that might do away entirely with that wooden wall and have some more natural treatment. Is that a possible outcome?
Through you, Madam Mayor, that's an option. So the first stage will be to look at the site and identify what options there are and the preferred option for replacement of the timber walling, and it may not be a similar timber wall.
No, thank you.
Councillors, anyone else with questions on this one? Okay, we'll move on to the next item. Which is item 8.7, adoption of Town of Bassendean communication policy and amendment of council protocols policy and repeal of associated policy. I believe this is yours, Ms. Adams.
There are a few attachments associated with this item, and I'd like to highlight and apologise that the current council policy 6.20 in your attachments is the incorrect version. So I have printed out a copy in front of you designed to replace the document that you emailed last week. So I do apologise, and next week at OCN. So the proposed new communications policy has its objective the consolidation of policies that relate to communications within the town in order to prevent duplication across multiple policies and also ease of access for councillors and staff. There are two primary policies that deal with communication, and these are communication between elected members and the administration. We're proposing that one be repealed, and also the council protocols policy, which is being suggested should be amended. Additionally, the proposed new policy seeks to implement better practice measures, plus incorporate key provisions within the Local Government Act, State Records Act, and Code of Conduct that relate to communication. So one of the objectives of this policy is to try and bring all that together in a one-stop shop to hopefully make it a bit easier. As mentioned, the first policy will be repealed if the draft policy, the new one, is accepted. The draft new policy contains the information found in the existing policy, but with greater clarity and deletion of repealed legislation. These include reference to local government rules of conduct regulations 2007 and repealed code of conduct. The council protocols policy requires an amendment to remove information related to communications from that policy to the draft policy. Finally, this work aligns
yes. When it says administration, we are clear it just means the staff in the administration, because I use the library all the time. Presumably, I can still go and borrow books.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
and you're a member of our community, and the expectation is that you will access our services.
Okay, so when you say administration, that doesn't mean like anything that's customer services, library, any of those that are provided to the community.
So is this
Staff there.
in reference, Councillor Carter, to how you communicate with staff
Well,
members?
it just says that communication by elected members with employees other than those identified at D above, and that's directors or executive managers, requires authorisation of the CEO. But I'm assuming that obviously couldn't mean, your library staff.
The expectation is that councillors are part of our community,
Yes.
and they're going to come across staff members in their everyday duties, and I always encourage my staff to say hello and warm greetings. What the protocols are designed to assist with is ensuring that if there is any request for information, anything that councillors would like clarified, etc., that they would come through the CEO or the executive team.
Sure.
Thank you. Can I just put those to these last few pages? Those must sort of those cats. That's correct. That's correct. Yeah. Okay. Councillors, Councillor McLennan.
It's just a request really. The draft policy makes reference to the Town of Bassendean record keeping plan. Could councillors be re-provided with that this week, please?
Certainly. There's also the councillor policy, the record keeping policy, which references the record keeping plan, and essentially all the obligations for councillors are within the
Okay.
record keeping policy. Councillor Wilding.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just following on from Councillor Carter's question, I understand that's the intention policy, but the wording as it's written in point 5 and 5.1 is quite specific, all communication. So is the intention fully captured in the wording of the policy?
So this is, this is in respect to your role as an elected member, but for example, if you were to go into customer services and pay your rates, I would expect you to call me.
I understand that, but the wording of the policy itself doesn't specify in the manner of elected members' business. It just said all communication between elected members.
Yeah,
Does-
your role as an elected member.
It doesn't say in the role though, it just says between.
If that requires further clarification, we can certainly take that on board. Any other questions, councillors? Councillor Rivka.
So just in relation to this policy, is that more or less just restating the, I suppose the relationships established under the Local Government Act, in that, elected members generally can communicate with officers, but they can't give them direction. So they can't say, give me this or do that. So if perhaps we could somehow, are we able to somehow make that more apparent to perhaps assist with Councillor Wilding's concern that it's sort of just those sorts of things which are prohibited. But I suppose the concern then is that if we have this code of conduct for those interactions, that potentially they could, where that there isn't compliance, that those could constitute breaches, and I don't think that's the intention, but just to make it clear that everyday conversations where an elected member isn't trying to overstep the bounds are acceptable, but just where those other things occur. And look, those things can occur. I mean, requests can be made, but if it's a specific request that you would be copied into that, is that essentially what this is trying to achieve?
Certainly. So the idea is under the CEO's functions, part of managing the day-to-day operations is to identify how councillors can access the administration, and so it has been the communication policy between elected members and the administration that's allowed that to be articulated. What we've tried to do is embed that within this new policy, but effectively it's
just on that, I guess, second tier, the executive managers, have we met all of those people?
With regards to the executive, it's
No,
basically everyone.
not the directors, you got that, so directors or executive managers.
So
Have
the
we?
executive managers are Nicole and Phil.
Well, I thought we were all directors. So just those four and no employees below?
Exactly.
or-
Well, effectively, the team in front of you is the team that manages all the functions across the organisation.
Okay. Right, thanks.
Can I just clarify something there? In respect to, there are times where in your emails or what have you, you provide instances where councillors are to contact certain staff who are not the executive. So that is your permission to do that. But also, for instance, your EMRC members around this table have quite regular access to the technical officer, which again, whilst you're in the room, does it all?
So I have set up those meetings, so I've spoken to that officer and we have spoken, and as long as that's authorised through the CEO.
So my question to that is, questions outside of that meeting time, because we all have questions that arise in our minds after we've had conversations, are we restricted in our discussions with that officer, if there are further questions arising?
What I would encourage you to do is to work through either the executive manager, sustainability and environment, or myself, and those questions will be passed on to the officer.
Okay, any other questions, councillors? Okay. So we go to 8.9, which is asset management policy. And I believe that's yours.
It is, thank you, Madam Mayor. We've got in this report to the council, we have our draft asset management policy, which is going up for council's consideration in the February OCM. The asset management policy is a important document for council as it sets the strategic direction for the district in our role as custodians of public infrastructure that underpins our services to our community. It sets out the objective, strategy and application for the management of assets to ensure they are strategically aligned, sustainable and meets service level targets for our community in the areas of property, recreation, transport and fleet management. To bring this into context, the suite of asset management documents across our portfolio of assets are informant documents that feed off and report back into our strategic community plan, corporate business plan and long-term financial plan. The intention is of this policy is to ensure that the town takes a long-term balanced approach that works in concert with the town's strategic goals, objectives and desires as set out in our strategic documents. Further to our recent asset management workshops where we as a group, we considered the range of asset management data, reports and plans. And this new asset management, updated asset management policy is going forward to council for the February OCM. Any questions?
So, councillors, questions? I have some questions on this one. Policy that we're seeing is just one document of a suite of documents that are with this. So the question I have is, how will council be provided oversight of the asset management strategy? And this is particularly important, I think, when new councils come on board. So I'm trying to actually ascertain how new councils or councillors will have access to those documents other than just the policy that's here in this agenda.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Mayor. Look, I think the asset management is an ongoing journey, and I think this needs to happen on a regular basis. And as we went through in the workshop, I'm happy to meet with individual councillors, particularly new councillors or councillors that would like to have an update. But we can also do this every year if council wishes to go through this detail. But it is a long-term journey, and we need to look at it in that way. You know, we measure it year upon year, but it would probably be worthwhile obtaining a rolling average of how our asset management is going. But as you can see through the integrated asset management framework, that the asset management policy provides the strategic direction for the rest of the suite of documents. But yes, we can continue. This journey does need to be done on a continual basis, and I'm happy to do that. And we need to look at that at every budget cycle as well, to make sure, you know, what were our measures, how are we travelling, are we addressing, you know, what's required, and through that process, through the budget process, the councillors do maintain oversight on what our level of investment is.
Which brings me to my other question, because there are so many policies that come before council that are marked for annual review, but this one is actually marked for review in 2025, and so I was curious about the longer timeline for this particular policy compared to some others that come before us that are marked for annual review.
Yes, I think, thank you, Madam Mayor. I think the asset management policy is a more forward-looking policy. I think if you did review it annually, not much would change in that time. But I think that the 3-year review period is appropriate for asset management. You could probably even extend it out a bit further, as it is a long-reaching area that the town looks after.
So, as an officer and manager of this area, would you see any benefit in potentially aligning a review of the policy and the asset strategy to coincide, so that new councils every 2 years are at least exposed to this information after the elections in October? Would you see benefit in that?
If council wishes, we can set that time period, but I would expect that in moving forward, it'd be my duty to meet with the new councillors and give them a rundown of where we are with our asset management and our portfolios, and I'm happy to continue that at an ongoing basis.
Councillor Carter.
Thank you. I suppose I'm a bit confused about what an asset actually is, because it needs to be defined. Am I assuming, what about heritage assets? What about our war memorial? What about things like that? Are they considered assets?
Yes, through you, Madam Mayor. There is a definition in the asset within the documents that states that an asset is anything over the value of $5,000, and I'll just try and find the reference.
Yes, I did see that. It's on the attachment under policy scope.
page 96 of the attachments.
Yes, thank you. Yes, 96.
Yes, thanks for that. Yes, of more than 1 year and a replacement cost of greater than $5,000. So, and yes, the War Memorial is an asset. Vehicles are an asset. The buildings are an asset, and the components of the buildings are assets as well. So the roof, air conditioning, HVAC, roads, footpaths, signs. We do track all of our assets.
I do understand plant buildings that have that sort of functional, useful life, but we do, in every local authority, would have a structures, buildings, things that would come under your asset management policy, but cannot really be. I mean, you wouldn't imagine that the War Memorial has a finite life, for instance.
No, it doesn't.
And then if we think in these terms, my question is to you, are we not then thinking about, well, heritage then has to fit into this narrow framework to be thought about in those terms, and clearly it shouldn't be, otherwise you'll get unintended consequences. This is my understanding. Is it yours?
Yes, to you, Madam Mayor. Yeah, that's correct. That we do need to make ensure we're tracking every asset to ensure that unintended consequences don't occur, that we don't forget about it. There is a sitting behind the documents that you have seen through the workshop. We do have a massive amount of data. I think it was 500,000 data points of pretty much everything is tracked, and it's well tracked by the town as well.
And if I can follow up to that question, thank you, Madam Mayor. So that means if you come against an asset like a war memorial, it cannot be treated in the same way as depreciation, whatever you treat the other assets.
I'll have to you, Madam Mayor, I'll have to take the war memorial on notice, because it is a different asset to a building or a road. It will degrade at a different rate. I would say at a much lesser rate. So it probably has a more finite, a longer life than the road assets. The road assets, for example, will be giving a road a lifetime of 20 to 40 years. Buildings are quite similar. But yes, I can take that question on notice and check what the lifespan of the war memorial has been set at. Yeah.
I really only use that, sorry, I didn't mean you to make a whole lot of work, and please don't. I use that as an example of how assets can't all be treated the same. Otherwise, our heritage assets are treated with the same sort of cavalier attitude that we might treat your pavements. And that then will, obviously, you all know where I'm coming from, that then gives us a mindset that we can then get rid of them. And any community, our heritage assets are crucial. And that's all I was trying to ask, whether we have different ways of determining.
I'm assuming that's a statement.
Well, I just would like to see some sort of thing in a policy like this, that there are some assets that would not necessarily come under these rules and ways of managing.
So Councillor Booth has a question, I believe.
Yeah, following on from Councillor Carter's line of reasoning. So we've got the policy scope, and it says assets essentially that support the delivery of one or more of the following services. So we've got property, recreation, transport, plant and equipment, waste management, information technology. Now, hopefully we're going to be getting a whole lot of statues from the public art contribution, and we've got things like a war memorial. They're assets, but they wouldn't necessarily fit into any of those categories. So they're certainly not recreation. I mean, something like a war memorial could potentially there be some other categories such as contemplation, reflection, commemoration, something of that nature, just to capture these assets that don't do anything in a tangible way, but they're important in that people come to pay their respects in the case of the War Memorial, or to whatever it is that people do when they look at art. So just to capture those as being legitimate uses. Is there some sort of new category we could have for those?
Yeah, through you, Madam Mayor, the town could include the town's art within its asset portfolio. Sitting here right now, I'm not sure where the War Memorial sits. I think the scope of property, recreation, transport, plant and equipment, waste management, information technology does cover a range of asset classes, and one could argue, and maybe the War Memorial is sitting within the recreational area, as it does sit in our parks and reserves. And I can look that up, but I don't think I can't actually think of any other assets that that we have that fall outside of this.
I think you're right.
Like we have jetties come into the recreational area as well. So.
Well, I think probably recreation would seem to be the best fit, but at the same time, I mean, whilst someone might like children climbing on playgrounds, they might not necessarily like children climbing on war memorials. So maybe a subtle difference, but as long as it's captured somewhere.
Councillor Ames, I believe you might have a question there.
Oh, no, it was more so just a comment. Thank you, Madam Mayor. After, again, Councillor Carter's line of questioning just in regards to the information that we've been provided, there's some data points from the Parks CapEx plan for Big Reserve that incorporate some of the War Memorial points, but I think, comments made by Councillor Pufka by separating things and ensuring that we've got some understanding about some specific areas within our town for asset management, I think were very important. Also, just having a quick chat with.
Just before you go on, so would I be correct in assuming that you would like the officer to potentially investigate where these assets reside in his different portfolios and come back with that information? Would that be?
I think that was the general gist of Councillor Carter's line of questioning prior to what I've just commented on. I'm not sure if that could be something that Mr. Adams can get a hold of.
Yeah, we can, to you, Madam Mayor, we can, I think it's the War Memorial, is that the question? So I can look at where that is. I think that is in the recreational area, but I can check.
Also, other aspects of the town potentially like our heritage grandstands at the Bassendean Oval Precinct. I'm not sure, there might be a few points that the councillors might come up with that might be a little bit more detailed, that you might be able to put some information together for us.
Yeah, the memorial grandstands are within the recreational area, and they are classified as heritage, so it's captured in that vein and managed in that way.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just to clarify, does the category of the assets listed under functionally change how it's managed, or is each asset managed on the merits of the individual asset and the categories are just for the purposes of categorising them?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. Through you, Madam Mayor, the main, I think there's a few drivers there. The main driver is to, we look at the service that it provides. So roads aren't really a transport service, but they enable a transport service. So it's really rated in the area of the services they provide to the community, and that's what our portfolio of assets is, and the function of local government is to provide those services for the community. So that's really how they're rated. So, the grandstands do provide a recreational service. I would also say the War Memorial provides a recreational service for the community. Not that the people are climbing on them or playing with them, but it is a recreational activity in a recreational area.
I suppose the crux of my question was, if you classify the War Memorial as property instead of recreation, if you can make a compelling argument for that, would that functionally change how you manage the asset, or would it just be a different line on the spreadsheet? Yeah, to Madam Mayor, you'd just be moving it from one area to another. We don't, although all this information sits within an asset management database, there's still components of asset management that relate through to knowledge and skill, and so we don't apply asset management in isolation. We don't stop using our interconnectedness with the community. We understand the functions of the assets. We understand their importance, and so there is, within the asset management framework, there's important components of that knowledge and skill, and to not look at asset management in isolation, but to look at it as part of community services.
So just quickly, just acknowledging some of the comments, not questions, that have been made tonight that indicate some concerns around asset management, particularly for historical structures. Can you just confirm, because my understanding is over recent years the reason we've invested so much time in your work, developing the asset plans and the strategy and policy and so on, has been because there's been recognition of less than ideal practices in the past, and it's an attempt for us to do better moving forward. Is that really where all of this is coming from? So in terms of the concerns that have existed previously, this is all an attempt to improve better practice for future, so these situations can be avoided where some assets have maybe not been managed as well as they potentially could have been.
Yes, thanks, Councillor, and through you, Madam Mayor. There has been a need for greater assessment, analysis, and response to those assessments in asset management across the town, and that pretty much goes against all areas of the portfolio: the fleet, the property, the transport area, IT, and the like. So it has been something that we've interrogated at a great degree, and I suppose this is the stage we're at now is probably about a year and a half into the journey of that. We need to look at our ratios. We need to going forward, and this is it's not something that we will tick off next week or tick off in the next few months. It's just an ongoing requirement for the town, in its capacity as looking after these community infrastructure, and it's important that the town also considers a framework, has a framework that sits in with our strategic plans, but also has the skills and knowledge to manage these assets appropriately as well. So, and I think that's where we are well placed to do that. And I just think we need to work through the final components of this, of having an appropriate policy, a contemporary policy, which this is now a contemporary policy that we're proposing, and also some good proposals that come through, or appropriate proposals that come through in the budget process over the coming months and coming years as well.
Thank you. Councillor Clifford.
Just a final question in relation to recreation. So all public open space, would that be classified as a recreation asset?
Thank you, Councillor, and to you, Madam Mayor. What's classified as an asset is mainly the structures within the recreational areas. So that'll include, although we have properties on the have buildings on the recreational areas, they're classified in the property area. But most of the structures are playground equipment, bores, reticulation, signage, seats, but not. So turf is not an asset, and trees are not an asset. So they're not classified as assets. So it's the physical things, I suppose, the structural things that you can see.
Not the
Lights.
land, not the land itself.
Not the land, no. Although the land does sit in the land's portfolio as a value per hectare or square metre, but the turf, such as main playing surfaces and the trees that we have around, are not classified as assets.
And on that point, just about the trees not being assets, I think that Deputy Mayor had at one point mentioned the possibility of perhaps we would try and bring the trees to account in some way to, I suppose, emphasise the value that the community puts on them. Is that? I was just saying that the trees, there was some discussion by the Deputy Mayor as to if and how those could be considered as assets, and whether that's something which we may do in future. Is that so? That's something which would be open for council to do if they saw fit to say that we want to start treating. Maybe you start with significant trees or all trees, but saying we want to treat them as an asset and get a feel for their value.
Through you, Madam Mayor. Look, I'm not sure that the industry has matured or developed enough to be able to do that at this stage. I'm not sure of anyone doing that. It could be something that we could attempt to do, but I'm actually not sure how we would do that, as the trees, it doesn't really sort of fit into the system that we use.
So if we were a trailblazer in that respect, it could potentially come at considerable expense?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
Councillors, I think we should move on. So we'll move on to item 8.10, which is the adoption of the quarterly report period ending 31st of December 2021.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. This is our quarterly report directly aligned to our corporate business plan for Q2 ending 31st of December. Also attached to the quarterly report are the council resolutions proposed for deletion. So those are the details. So I'll take any questions.
Councillors, questions? Councillor McLeod.
I just had a question about the strategic communications. I forgot what we call that. My screen is frozen. Hold on a second. The strategic communications. So on page 20 of 24, it says that we're at the stage of finalising it. And obviously we had the workshop late last year where there was the presentation from the consultant who has assisted in this work. I'm just wondering whether what the next steps are, if there's any plans for councils to have further input, just acknowledging that particular evening there wasn't a lot of opportunity for discussion. There was a lot of receiving information from the consultant.
So there was a update provided in a recent bulletin of the movement in terms of what we're doing and tracking against. I could provide a more granular view of that if that's all.
I may need to go back and remind myself of what that process is that you've already outlined. But what you're telling me is that there are other steps between now and the finalisation where
That's
there'll be
correct.
opportunity.
So there are some things coming up. For example, in February, we hope to have a digital strategy developed. There are also some other opportunities in terms of there's a timeline that we're looking in terms of future engagements and so on, so we can be more sort of proactive. So there are some things like that that are in the pipeline.
Great, excellent. Just the finalisation, I thought, I was hoping for a bit more there. And just my other question was in relation to page 6. It's the reference to the creation of a BIC concept plan that was earmarked for this quarter. How do we foresee that progressing?
Through Madam Mayor, that's something that's currently being worked upon with myself, Phil and Nicole. We've just been waiting for a couple of staff members to return from leave, and we're convening in the next couple of weeks with a view to mapping out, I suppose, the known and fixed components of the reserve, and then effectively evaluating what can be done or what should be done with the balance, particularly with a particular focus on the planting of additional vegetation, which I believe was one of the reasons that sort of led to the council resolution in the first place.
Thank you.
So can I follow on from that particular one? How do you propose to bring back that BIC concept plan? Will it come back to council or will it come to a workshop? How do you propose to actually bring that back to us?
Through Madam Mayor, probably in the first instance, circulating it to the bulletin, and then obviously seeking feedback. If there's still no feedback or there was no concern, we may as well bring it to council for adoption. Given may not typically have council adopt a landscaping plan or a concept plan, however, given it stems from a council resolution, it would be appropriate to tie it off by way of a subsequent council resolution.
Councillors, other questions? Councillor Wilding.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. On page 107 of the attachments, page 10 of the actual report.
Sorry, what page was that?
Page 107. Sorry, I'll take the last one. 107 in the attachments. For point reserve, it says on track and that there's a school activity scheduled for February 2022. Could you elaborate on what the school activity is?
Through you, Madam Mayor, so there's a workshop planned for Monday next week where we're asking the students, we're telling them about the reserve and seeking their feedback on what types of features they might like to see at the reserve, which will involve like a drawing activity. So that's what the activity is.
So further to that, my understanding is that after that, there will be a workshop for councillors in respect to point. So is that the first or second week in March?
It's on the 8th of March.
Okay, councillors, any other questions on this item?
Can I just ask one more? Sorry, just on the public health plan, it's noted as a draft developed to be advertised. I know that there was a previous draft that was then had some additional work done. So this is obviously the revised draft, is it? And is that something that the draft will go to the committee and then come back to council, or how's this envisioned?
What we were hoping to do is just a final review going on in updated PHP, which is quite a dense document. There's also been some work done on a sort of digestible document, because some members of the committee might just be interested in looking at the cohort they belong to. So probably is beneficial from a community perspective. So both those documents are being finalised. I've actually spoken to Mr. Gibson in terms of the intent is to certainly circulate via the bulletin, but whether we will go out to the community and then bring it back to council.
Through Madam Mayor, yes, that's correct. That would be the intended process. Is that again, probably not too dissimilar to the Big Reserve concept plan, running the materials of the bulletin. Councillors were generally comfortable with that for release for public consultation. We'd undertake that task and bring the draft document back with the submissions that council can adopt or otherwise in line with those submissions.
Great, thank you.
Councillor Blifka.
So yeah, page 110 of the attachments. So just all the work that's going on there with the management of the existing future trees. You've got develop longer-term tree planting and biodiversity corridors program. Is that something which will come before council? Is that going to take the form of an approved street tree list or something of that nature? I mean, what is that item?
Thanks, Councillor. Yes, through you, Madam Mayor. There's a few items. I think it just needs to be considered within context of. There's a few other items there. We do have the tree succession planning focusing on verge trees just above it. So that is currently underway, and what we've added into this guidelines is into this quarterly report is the development of longer term tree planting biodiversity corridor program, which takes in not only the street trees but the whole area. So previously the measure was on street trees only, and now we're broadening that out to encompassing the whole of the town. And that's an important progression.
Private lands,
Oh, look, it's a focus on our land, so our natural areas, our reserves, and our street trees, and that's to give a more holistic approach.
Will the street trees be considered having regard to the changing climate, or will we be looking at sort of trying to future-proof against projections of what weather conditions we're likely to experience in the future?
Yeah. Through you, Madam Mayor. There was extensive work done on that over the past couple of years, where we do have an endorsed list of species, which is about 25. That's street tree species that can also be incorporated into the natural areas as well. I think it's also important for councillors to consider that that's part of. This is also part of separate programs where the natural areas undertake significant plantings every year, not just trees but also other
And that
hedges.
Approved list, is that an internal document or is that published on the website? It is advertised at certain points, and we did meet today to discuss the upcoming marketing program for this. So that'll be all republished on the website, but it has been published on the website previously. It's been published under residents' request for trees program, and mail outs. It'll be coming into this next month's Thrive edition as well. So there'll be upcoming information on the street tree program and the tree program at a greater level. That list is consistent from year to year, or it changes based on the availability of stock?
Yeah, it does, through you, Madam Mayor. Availability of stock is an issue. All local governments are going to this sort of planting at least 1,000 trees a year, so stock availability is an issue. We have to get our orders in. Our order for this winter went in last October, and we need to start moving that program and our planning further and further ahead to achieve better results and more efficiencies and end up with the stock that we want.
So that item's not so much not started, it's ongoing, is that?
It was to separate the two items above and below,
right.
Whereas the street trees is quite well developed, but we haven't been developing a longer term plan for our reserves. So the wording of it, I think, has become a bit could be improved, I think, but the development of the succession planting and the biodiversities in our biodiversity planting in our street trees is well developed, but we haven't developed it that well in our reserves, although there is a lot of biodiversity in our natural areas as well. So I think the wording in here can be improved, to be more succinct.
Councillor
Thank you.
Fraser?
Oh, thank you, Madam Mayor. following on from Councillor Kalifka's point, why, if there's a problem with stock of street trees, we're not encouraging our local preservation group and reserves management volunteers to be starting to be helping out in that respect? Because they used to, once upon a time, do this.
Thank you, Councillor. Through the Mayor,
thank
we
you.
do work quite closely with Bassendean Preservation Group, and they do grow trees for us. I believe the stock issue is more to do with mature trees. So
Okay.
tube stock, the availability is quite good.
Good, thank you very much.
Can I have a follow-up question here? In that, when we do projects, quite often that involve a lot of planting, that usually in successive years there needs to be fill-in planting to replenish any stock that has died or to be beefed up. So are we actually doing that? I'm particularly thinking of the Green Trail. I know that there was additional planting done in the winter, but are we planning to actually look at these projects which are essentially completed, but to go back each year and fill in those areas that have died? Is that part of the program of works?
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor. Look, it is an ongoing ongoing requirement for us to keep doing that. There sometimes maybe the stock that we obtained wasn't that good, maybe the planting wasn't that good, maybe it's heat stress or some other issue. So we do continue to monitor our street trees. We do have although similar to the questions we had before, we don't have an asset management regime for it, but all the street trees are mapped and they are recorded in their condition, and so that is an ongoing issue for the town and for our staff to keep monitoring.
Councillors, any more questions on this item? Okay, so we'll move on to 10.11, which is mid-year budget review, annual budget 2021-22. Assuming this is Mr. White.
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor. So the purpose of this report, councillors, is to present the mid-year review and the budget for 2021-22 for adoption. Mid-year review is largely one of realignments and corrections of some low-cost capital and operating projects, as shown on the attachments. Overall, we are just over $900,000 better off than we had budgeted to this point. The proposed budget review seeks to maintain the initial surplus that was forecast at the start of the year, which was $254,000, with the balance to be allocated to reserve funds, as shown on page 49 of the agenda. It is recommended that Council adopts the budget review. Thank you.
Thank you, councillors. Questions? Councillor Ames.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Mayor, and through you to Mr. White. These documents we saw last week at our workshop, correct?
Through you, Madam Mayor, that's correct. Yes.
There have been some amendments to it, obviously, since we've seen these documents, correct?
I think there's been some amendments since they were issued in the CEO bulletin.
Right.
I wasn't aware of any since the...
I've just got one question, just in regards to new project requests.
Yes.
I think the addition to this, or these lines here, of solar charging bollards. I'm pretty sure I didn't see that particular line in the previous documents that were distributed, so I wanted to find out what they were all about, where they're located, are they replacements, are they new installs, and what that particular new project is all about.
Through you, Madam Mayor, so they were in the presentation at the councillor workshop. They're bollards that have been ordered, and they are used to charge mobile phones, so you can place them in a public space and they run from solar power.
Must have absolutely missed that one, but I really appreciate the follow-up. That's pretty cool.
You just, the last page there, 130. We've got valuations for 122 Hamilton Street. Amount of 20,000 is listed there?
To do the valuation.
Through you, Madam Mayor, this probably goes back to a CEO bulletin from a couple of weeks ago, which from there went back to a decision of council before that. So this relates to the decision of council to not pursue the SHERP grant for social housing, but instead default back to a previous resolution of council, which was to investigate a series of options for the site. As set out in the CEO bulletin, the number of permutations that are possible is numerous, and based on a $1,000 or $1,500 evaluation, and if council wanted to pursue all the various permutations, it would be in the order of $20,000. Staff put an item in the CEO bulletin seeking council's input on whether there were any particular options they did not wish to pursue, which would have, if there was a broad view that certain options were not worth pursuing, that would obviously have a downward impact on the actual funds required for the valuations. Staff received one response to the CEO's bulletin, but broadly there was no feedback from the balance of councillors.
Mr. Gibson, I can't actually give feedback on that particular one, given I've stepped out of the room for each time it's come up before council.
Well, I'll speak not to the decision itself, just to the valuation. So if there are, as you say, 20 odd permutations, perhaps if that's put to councillors in a different way, maybe trying to say, well, limit it to 10 or something. But if we could reduce that amount by half, it's a start. It's a bit more money there. Is that something which could be done, or do we have to go through all those?
Through Madam Mayor, that is what was specifically being asked of council at the time. So yes, it could be done.
I'll certainly put something in on that one. So thank you for that.